Africa, like the former countries of the Soviet Union, has accumulated a large number of different presidents who imagined themselves as superhumans and became dictators. If we analyze the entire reign of each such ruler, we can notice that there are not so many differences. Of course, the styles of governance vary slightly, but the overall concept remains unchanged. But there are exceptions everywhere. Our African character today is one of them. We will talk about the dictator named Jean-Bédel Bokassa. He is one of the harshest presidents in Africa, who proclaimed himself the emperor of his country and crowned himself like Napoleon. He also had a taste for dining on human flesh and was one of those who licked Brezhnev. Just kidding, it was a fraternal kiss. And don't be surprised that he consumed human flesh. He comes from the Mbaka clan, which still practices cannibalism. In this video, we will discuss his dictatorship. Welcome to the Hustler channel, and enjoy the show. Jean-Bédel Bokassa came to power through somewhat dishonest means. After returning from the army, the country's first president, Dictator, who was also his cousin, appointed him as the head of the country's armed forces. However, this turned out to be the worst decision on his part. In 1965, Bokassa decided to stage a revolutionary coup in the country with the help of the army, and he succeeded. During the revolution, he arrested Dictator, as well as his aides and deputies, and sent them to prison. After that, Bokassa quickly consolidated all power in his hands. In the first days, he completely dissolved the entire parliament and abolished the country's constitution, issuing a series of new laws that were repressive in nature and made his rule unlimited. Since the Central African Republic was rich in precious stones and nuclear energy, France did not want to miss such a partner. Therefore, they supported all of Bokassa's endeavors. The first investments were made in the country. The new president began building roads and even opened the first and only university in the Central African Republic. In 1971, on his orders, all female prisoners were released on Mother's Day, and all men who were imprisoned for crimes against women were sentenced to death on the same day. Having seized all power, Bokassa ruled with the harshest rules. If there was even a slight hint of protest against the supreme ruler, he would shoot all those involved, even innocent people, without hesitation. Later, mass graves with hundreds of dead bodies would be found in this country. The lists of the disappeared without a trace would only grow. The intelligence agencies would drive through the streets every day, searching for opponents of Bokassa's regime. The number of people who could do anything against the dictator was diminishing every day. However, Jean-Bédel's bloody policies did not bother anyone outside the country. France constantly received precious stones, and the elite in Paris were more than satisfied with that, so they turned a blind eye to everything. It can be said that Bokassa simply bribed the entire French government. Over time, Jean-Bédel grew tired of the ordinary title of the country's president. And in 1976, the world heard about a new emperor from Africa named Jean-Bédel Bokassa. The newly proclaimed monarch planned his coronation for December 4, 1977, following the example of Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation on December 2, 1804. Bokassa was a true admirer of Napoleon. Meanwhile, the empire was turned upside down to ensure the success of the coronation. He spent half of the country's annual budget on it. Bokassa celebrated his coronation for 2 days, an event Africa had never seen before. 2,500 foreign guests were invited to the coronation. Suitable, well-maintained accommodations had to be found for each of them in Bangui, the capital of the newly established empire. The corresponding committee had to solve this problem. Houses, apartments, and hotels were renovated to match the theme of the grand ceremony. Another committee was tasked with making the capital shine and sparkle, enchanting foreign guests. Streets were cleaned, buildings were painted, and homeless and poor people were removed from sight. The imperial garment industry was flooded with work. New costumes were needed for hundreds of local guests, following strict protocols. White suits for school children, dark blue for middle management, and black for ministers and officials. Bokassa enthusiastically and meticulously demanded that the details of his ceremony match those of Napoleon's. A team of 30 French craftsmen was hired to create an eagle-shaped throne at a total cost of $2.5 million. Additionally, an antique carriage was purchased in Nice and transformed to adhere to the Napoleonic style. The ceremonial attire was made in collaboration with the Jeslin Company, which tailored uniforms for Napoleon. In total, 13 costumes were ordered, costing $145,000, while the Empress's coronation dresses, for both the first and 19th wives of Bokassa, amounted to $72,000. The total cost of jewelry, including the imperial scepter and sword, reached around $5 million. Emperor Bokassa's shoes even made it into the Guinness World Records as the most expensive in the world. The ceremonial part was followed by a festive dinner. Tables were set with silver cutlery and plates adorned with gold decorations, laden with delicacies. Caviar from Iran, rolls with crab meat, antelope meat with a hunter's sauce, foie gras. For dessert, there was a huge 7-layered imperial cake from which half a dozen doves were released. Over 240 tons of food and beverages were flown in from Europe. There were about 40,000 bottles of wine alone. During the meal, Bokassa smiled and told the French minister, "You probably didn't understand, but I served you human meat." Later, the French politician admitted that he was unsure whether it was a joke or not. However, nothing changed in the new country, or rather the Central African Empire. Harshness and terror ruled the country. The slightest transgression resulted in excessive punishment. For example, thieves had their ears cut off after 2 offenses and their hands after a 3rd. Moreover, Bokassa often personally attended such judicial proceedings. Dissidents and potential rivals were removed from power, expelled from the country, subjected to arrests, medieval tortures, and executions. He literally consumed his political opponents. Parts of the bodies of the executed would occasionally end up in a large imperial refrigerator. Bokassa himself referred to human flesh as sugar pork. During his travels, he always carried canned meat that no one else could touch except him. Later, Bokassa issued a decree stating that all barefoot school children attending the only school in Bangui had to come to classes wearing expensive uniforms produced by one of his mistresses. Parents could barely afford the textbooks necessary for their children's education, let alone clothing. But the dictator didn't care. Once, the imperial guard gathered 200 poor school children and lined them up in the prison yard. Threatening the children with weapons, the guards led them to overcrowded cells. A few weeks later, the killings began. One by one, children were taken away to try on school uniforms and ruthlessly killed. Throughout his life, Bokassa killed 300,000 people, which at that time accounted for 1/5 of the country's population. In June 1970, Bokassa visited the Soviet Union on an official visit. Among all things, he was most impressed by the ritual of fraternal kisses during a meal with Brezhnev. Upon his return home, he kissed all the ministers, stating that it was a way to find out if someone had bad intentions. If their lips were wet and relaxed, it meant they were sincere. If they were dry and hot, they could not be trusted. In the end, Bokassa was accused of his crimes and sentenced to death. But a year later, the death penalty was abolished in the Central African Republic. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison but served only 7 years before being released. After his release, he became a vegetarian and proclaimed himself the 13th apostle. In 1996, Bokassa died of a heart attack, bringing an end to his bloody dictatorship. This video was prepared by the Hustler channel. Be sure to leave your opinion about this dictator under the video, support the channel on Patreon, and also subscribe to the channel and watch other videos. This was Hustler. Until we meet again.